So I know it's traditional to end with thanks, but I thought I'd start with it. So I know we've all seen celebrity award shows where people thank everyone from their first primary school teacher to the family cat. So I know these things can sound a bit insincere and tired, but I hope you'll believe me when I say it's the honor of my life to stand up here amongst you, my MDS second family. And I'm going to mention several people by name during the talk, but I couldn't possibly thank everyone who's inspired me and helped me along the way, so thank you to you too. And I'd like to thank the patients I've met who, have shown this amazing ability to keep hope and joy in times when really it shouldn't be there. It's an awe-inspiring thing to see. And thank you also to my family who've been a rock to help me along the way through successes and failures, keeping me going and keeping me grounded every day. So some stories start at the beginning, obviously with a lot more hair. But the story I want to tell you today starts at Queen Square about 25 years ago when I met Kailash Bhatia and John Rothwell. So Kailash showed me, as I know he has to so many, the amazing immediacy of movement disorders. It's all right there in front of you if you can only learn to perceive it. And John showed me the power of electrophysiology to be able to probe the sensory motor function of the body and how that might go wrong in people with movement disorders. And it also showed me this benefit of this kind of specialist clinical academic environment to patients and their families. That I go from this person having these odd movements that no one understands to a situation where somebody sees me and they think I'm valuable. They don't think I'm weird or strange and they want to help me. I had someone to learn with on the beginning of that journey because I started my PhD with Yingzhu Huang, and that meant I was able to be a small part of Yingzhu and John Rothwell's groundbreaking work in theta burst stimulation that sort of brought the promise of non-invasive stimulation in a more accessible way to people with brain disorders. And I'll always be very grateful for having known Yingzhu as a friend and colleague. So it might seem a long way from here to the world of functional neurological disorder, but not really, because these patients were everywhere. They're 20% of the people being referred to the specialist movement disorders clinics I was involved in at Queen Square. And also, I was kind of curious, because often the diagnosis was given in a way where it sounded like it was good news. It's great, there's nothing really wrong with you. But in fact, these people were really unwell, and they didn't really seem to get much better either. So I want to tell you about a critical turning point for me. And I can still remember the clinic room I was in on a dark and cold Tuesday afternoon, and I was giving the diagnosis of a functional movement disorder to someone in the traditional way. We've done the tests, they're all normal, it's great news. We often see these problems when people are stressed, when they've had traumatic experiences, and maybe you should see a psychiatrist. And this particular patient wasn't angry. In fact, that would have been easier to dismiss and rationalize. But she just looked at me in this way which said, "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." And in that moment, I realized that she was right. That if I dug down below the surface of what I was saying, it just didn't really make any sense. So, first of all, we'd fallen into this massive explanatory gap. So, first, how were these things happening? What's the mechanism? And why was this happening to her? And I realized that it's just not good enough, it's not scientific enough to explain that by saying, oh, it's non-organic, or it's psychological, as if that's a complete and satisfying explanation. It's a bit like your maths homework. You need to show some working out. And that was it for me, because once you say these movement disorders are real, they have a mechanism, then for me it was like a curtain was lifted on an amazing world that I'd never really thought about before. But of course, lots of other people had. So Wittgenstein asked this, what I think is a really insightful question. So what is left over if I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I moved my arm? So one answer to that is will. And when you look at medical history, this interface between will and the body is something that people have thought about a lot, that the mechanism of FND must be somewhere there. So Brodie, back in 1837, said, it's not the muscles that do not obey the will, it's the will itself that does not enter into the action. Paget, saying, she says, I cannot, it looks like I will not, but it is I cannot will. And Charcot understood that this was, whatever was going wrong was a kind of malfunction in a dynamic system that's got stuck in the wrong place somewhere, but it holds within it this possibility of normal function being possible. So when you start to think about it, functional symptoms are not strange at all. If there's a system that allows me conscious, voluntary access to the body, that allows me to get my will into my body, then surely it can go wrong. And if it were to go wrong, you'd expect exactly the kind of problems that people with FND tell you and me about all the time in the clinic. So it would actually be really weird if functional symptoms didn't exist. They're not a mystery. Why are we talking about them as medically unexplained? They're just an entirely expected consequence of existing as a conscious human being. So this started a journey which I'm still on today and where I've had the privilege to work with many fantastic people. The other really important part of it to me has just been to see thousands and thousands of people with FND. So if I'm allowed to give any advice to those of you starting out on your movement disorders journey, it's this: just see as many people as you possibly can with the conditions you're interested in. Because you're going to see phenomena, you're going to see patterns that are hidden, but often in plain sight. And for me, it let me also test out and get rid of most of the preconceptions I had about people with FND. So I picture the body of research and clinical work. The slides have just stopped. I picture this body of research and clinical work in FND that I've been one of many contributing to, a bit like a cell that's assembled from lots of different organelles that all start working together to produce something wonderful. So the first organelle for me was exploring this mechanistic question of how these phenomena could happen. So what was the answer to Wittgenstein's question? So I found at least the start to that answer for me in predictive coding, which is a statistical theory of conscious perception and voluntary action, championed by Carl Friston. And I think for me, this was just the start of finding a way to put the phenomenology of FND in the brain, to put it physically, organically in the organ where it belongs, but also in a way that permits integration with psychiatric and psychosocial levels of understanding. Next, thinking about what it might be sensible to call this condition with Tony Lang, John Stone, Joe Jankovic and others, making the case for what I still think is the least worst word we have to describe this problem. And it's something that's fundamentally acceptable to patients. And also, if you use it correctly and not in a sort of neuro-reductionist way, it can hold within it multiple levels of explanation and understanding, all the way from neural networks through to psychosocial stressors and everything in between. Next, thinking about how to explain the disorder, here with John Stone, suggesting that we use these tricks that we're taught to make diagnoses as fantastic explanatory aids, the beginning of treatment. It's just so much more powerful than telling someone their MRI scan is normal, because this shows you, or you can show them in clinic, exactly how you've made the diagnosis and what the problem must be, that it's a problem with them being able to control or access their body normally, even though they're trying, and even though the basic wiring of the system is okay. Next, building on work from many others, including Marina Tisson, Francesca Morganti, and Michele Tinase, to develop evidence for investigations that don't just tell you that there's not a disease process present, but they actually provide positive evidence that this is a functional disorder to a sort of laboratory-supported level of confidence, here with work in functional tremor with Petra Schwingenschut. Next, trying to explore the pathophysiology, particularly supported by Isabelle Paris, and being part of a growing field that's led by so many others, including Mark Hallett, David Perez, Selma Ibeck, and Teresa Serenova, finding unfeignable, unfakeable phenomena in people with FND. For example, abnormally accurate force matching. So these sorts of findings, they force us to say, well, we can't use malingering as a kind of easy, get-out-of-jail-free way of describing functional disorders. But they're also entirely consistent with what patients tell you and me in clinic, that they've lost control over their bodies, they've lost agency over their bodies. Next, looking at trying to develop better treatments, here with the incredible support of Glenn Nielsen in developing and trialling specific physiotherapy techniques in people with functional motor disorders. Work that's been moved forward by so many others, from trials of psilocybin and non-invasive brain stimulation, all the way to novel ways of delivering psychotherapeutic interventions and multidisciplinary rehabilitation. Next, the development of patient organisations, still something that amazes me, because this is just about this condition becoming normal. It's what we'd expect for anything else, that patients and their families have some ownership of the narrative of what's going on. And it also means that neurology trainees, psychiatry trainees, allied health professionals might have an idea that they could bring FND into their clinical practice, maybe have a career focus in FND. And then lastly, the development of services. And this for me is like the sort of final output, the wonderful product of this cell. It's come alive. So things like international and national diagnostic and treatment guidelines, national service specifications, they all again show that this condition is becoming a bit more normal and creating services that can include this huge complexity and diversity of people with FND, truly merging mind, brain and body in one integrated system. There's so much left to be discovered and done, and I can't wait to see what happens next. But there's more, because maybe you're not that interested in FND, and that's okay, But the story I'm going to finish with is how perhaps they hold the key to a massive untapped opportunity for gains in health for people with chronic illness. So let's take a group of people with a chronic disease, let's say ischemic heart disease. And what we're going to do is we're going to correlate a disease measurement, let's say left ventricular ejection fraction, with patient-reported symptoms, disability, and quality of life. So whenever people have done this, and whatever chronic disease people have looked at, the correlation is about 0.5, meaning that fully 50% of the variance in outcome is not explained by the disease measurement. Just think about people that you see in your own practice, maybe two people with the same disease, same apparent stage of the disease, but completely different personal outcomes. So you could say, well, maybe we need to improve our disease measurement techniques. And I think that's probably true to some extent. But it misses this bigger point. So to make that point, I'd like to do a little language experiment with you. So ask yourself, why is it that we say, I have Parkinson's disease, I have cancer, I have diabetes, but then I am sick, I am ill? So one's a state of having, the other's a state of being. So I was talking before about a brain system that provides an interface between our conscious cells, our body and the world, and which goes wrong in people with FND. But that system's present and active in me, and in you, and in every person who's ill. And that system's dynamic is not just passively reading out the state of the body. It's got a physiology, it's got a pathophysiology, it's got risk and resilience factors, it's got things you can do in terms of treatment, it's alive. And that's exactly why we talk about being sick or ill, because the human impact, the lived experience of a disease, the thing we're actually bothered about or care about changing in medicine, is fundamentally dependent not just on the disease, but also on the function of this system that allows us to be conscious of our body and to interact with it and the world. So we could take Wittgenstein's statement about movement and ask a slightly different question. So what's left over if I subtract the fact that I have a disease from the fact that I am sick or ill? So that's a human equation that deserves solving. And I think the answer is this system. Let's call it a psychosomatic interface that provides the conscious interface with our body and the world. So by rearranging this equation, you can see that we have to consider both the disease and the function of this system, this psychosomatic interface, to truly understand the human outcome. And that's exactly why disease measurements correlate so poorly with the lived experience of illness. But what it means is that if we scientifically study in a rigorous way the illnesses that primarily sit at that psychosomatic interface, that means that we might not unlock just their better health and well-being, but potentially that of many with chronic illness. So isn't that an amazing turnaround, that some of the most ignored people, people with functional symptoms, people with mental illness, people impacted by psychosocial stresses and traumas, could in fact hold the answers about how to improve health for us all? Now that's fine, you might say. It's a nice story, but what can I actually do? I mean, I can hardly do all the things that I've got to do at the moment, and you're asking me to do something else. So I think there is a place to start, something we can all do now, and that's to embody a rehabilitative attitude. So let me be clear what I mean by that phrase. A rehabilitative attitude means that we take a conscious decision to look up, and we bring into our field of view both sides of that human equation, working to attack the disease, yes, but also recognizing our responsibility to be curious about how we could intervene at that psychosomatic interface to empower the person to be less ill, even though symptoms from the disease are still present. And that rehabilitative attitude means a different relationship with the patient. So the thing is, you can't do rehabilitation to someone. It requires their participation. So a rehabilitative attitude means that we're doing something beyond the thing we might say we do already, which is that we're trying to put the patient at the center of things. But we do that and we ask them to act. We require them to participate, and we support them to do it in the best way that they possibly can. And a rehabilitative attitude does not mean outsourcing to therapists. So I spoke before about the FND cell, full of scientific insights and clinical experience from physios, from psychologists, from psychiatrists, social scientists, patients, their families, neuroscientists, neurologists. So that, all of that, can be part of your knowledge too. And if it is, then it means you become a particular kind of generalist. So the amazing specialist knowledge that you have to diagnose and treat specific diseases is wrapped up in another set of skills relating to that psychosomatic interface. And those skills reflect my responsibility as a doctor to have a truly scientific interest in the being bit of being ill. I can't just live in a specialist bubble, walled off and say, oh, I'm sorry, that bit's not my job. Now, I know that these are some of the hardest things to do well in medicine, and they're particularly hard to make happen in the kind of often dysfunctional health systems that we're working in. But this rehabilitative attitude is such a prize because it combines this amazing scientific revolution in understanding basic mechanisms of disease and how to fix them, with an equally intense, equally serious scientific revolution in understanding the pathophysiology of that psychosomatic interface and supporting it to function better. So unfortunately, one certainty in life is that we ourselves and those we care about will be ill. So what's the healthcare system like that you'd like to be ill in? I'd like to be treated in a system which solves that human equation, that takes those fantastical, often completely infuriating, multidimensional people that we are and meets us with a mirror of compassionate science and human understanding, a true rehabilitative positive to the negatives of illness. And it also means that we need to hold that mirror up to ourselves, to treat ourselves with the same rehabilitative attitude, to strive to be the best, to be ambitious, to be clever, but also to recognize that we can't do everything and to be compassionate to ourselves when things just don't work out the way we planned. But if we can do that, then that's a place where through the skills and knowledge and humanity of people like you, even if I'm ill, I'm as much me as I can be, still telling my story until it ends. Thank you.